During the 1960s, the country's predominantly African American inner cities were swept by outbreaks of violence. Their basic causes were long-standing grievances, police insensitivity and brutality, inadequate educational and recreational facilities, high unemployment, poor housing, and high prices. Yet the outbreaks were mostly unplanned. Unlike the race riots of earlier decades, when whites menaced African Americans, the outbreaks of the 1960s involved the looting and burning of mostly white-owned property in black neighborhoods. The fighting that took place was mainly between African American youths and the police. Hundreds of lives were lost, and tens of millions of dollars worth of property was destroyed. The most serious disturbances occurred in the Watts area of Los Angeles, California, in August 1965 and in Newark, New Jersey, and Detroit, Michigan, in July 1967. Some of the militant black leaders were arrested, and others, such Elbridge Cleaver, fled the country. This loss of leadership seriously weakened some of the organizations. Black Power became popular in the late 1960s. The slogan was first used by Carmichael in June 1966 during a civil rights march in Mississippi. Essentially, it refers to all the attempts by African Americans to maximize their political and economic power. Among the outstanding modern advocates of Black Power was Malcolm X, who rose to national prominence in the early 1960s as a minister in the Nation of Islam, or Black Muslim movement. Malcolm broke with the leader of the Black Muslims, Elijah Muhammad, and founded the Organization of Afro-American Unity before he was assassinated in February 1965. The Black Power movement was stimulated by the growing pride of Black Americans in their African heritage. This pride was strikingly symbolized by the Afro hairstyle and the African garments worn by many young blacks. Black pride was also manifested in student demands for Black studies programs, Black teachers, and dedicated facilities, and in an upsurge in African American culture and creativity. The new slogan, updated from Harlem Renaissance poet Langston Hughes, was "Black is Beautiful." The Vietnam War, in which African American soldiers participated in disproportionately high numbers, tended to divide the Black leadership and divert white liberals from the civil rights movement. National Urban League leaders minimized the war's impact on the African American home front. Participation had become a racist intrusion into non-white countries' affairs was shared by other African American leaders, including King. He organized the Poor People's Campaign, a protest march on Washington, D.C., before he was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee, in April 1968. Anger and frustration over his assassination set off more disturbances in the inner cities. James Earl Ray, a white small-time crook, was tried and convicted of the murder. The civil rights movement underwent a marked shift in emphasis after 1970. Legislative goals had largely been achieved. And even more significant than some of the civil rights laws was President Lyndon Johnson's Great Society program. Established as a war on poverty, it greatly expanded welfare programs. One goal of the Great Society was to help realize some of the intentions of civil rights legislation. This could only be done by opening up opportunities for African Americans in schooling, housing, and the labor force. Thus, a new emphasis emerged. Affirmative action programs tried to remedy the effects of historical discrimination by assuring present opportunities. Sometimes quota systems were used in school admission and job hiring, a policy that was denounced by some non-blacks as reverse discrimination. Affirmative action programs helped African Americans achieve notable gains in education and allowed Black families to rise into the middle and upper middle class. Nevertheless, many African Americans continue to face difficult social and economic challenges, especially in the inner cities. The tensions in some impoverished city neighborhoods came in 1992, when 4 white police officers were acquitted in the beating of Rodney King, an African-American motorist, in Los Angeles. Hours after the acquittal, the city erupted in riots in which more than 50 people were killed. Smaller riots broke out in other cities. Political progress. The voter registration drives that intensified during the 1960s began to show results by the end of the decade. In 1960, only about 28% of the African American voting age population in the South was registered, and there were perhaps 100 African American elected officials. By 1969, with the number of registrants more than doubled, up to 1,185 African Americans had been elected to state and local offices. Some of the electoral gains were spectacular. The first black chief executive of a major city was an appointee, Walter E. Washington, who became the Commissioner of Washington, D.C., in 1967. In other cities, African Americans were elected. Mayor Carl Stokes in Cleveland, Ohio, Richard Hatcher in Indiana, in 1967, Maynard Jackson in Atlanta in 1973, Ernest N. Morial in New Orleans in 1977, Richard Arrington in Birmingham in 1979, Wilson Goode in Philadelphia, and Harold Washington in Chicago in 1983, Kurt L. Schmoke in Baltimore in 1987. Son in Newark in 1969, Tom Bradley in Los Angeles. Also in 1987, Carrie Saxon Perry of Hartford, Connecticut, became the first black woman to be elected mayor of a large city. An African American became mayor of the largest city in the United States in 1989 when David Dinkins won the general election after a stunning primary defeat of New York City's incumbent mayor. Bradley's attempt, in California, to become the country's first elected black governor failed in 1982, but 7 years later Douglas Wilder of Virginia reached that milestone. African American politicians made gains on the national level as well. The first black senator since the Reconstruction period was Edward W. Burke of Massachusetts, who served from 1967 to 1979. In 1992, Illinois voters elected Carol Moseley Braun to be the first African American woman in the U.S. Senate. The first African American named to the Supreme Court was Thurgood Marshall, in 1967. When Marshall retired in 1991, he was succeeded by another black associate justice, Clarence Thomas. The first African American member of a presidential cabinet was Robert C. Weaver, Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, HUD, 1966. Another Secretary of HUD, Patricia Roberts Harris, was the first black woman in the cabinet, 1977. Andrew Young was named ambassador to the United Nations in 1977. In 1989, Colin Powell, a 4-star general in the Army, was chosen to be chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the country's highest military post. In 2001, Powell also became the first African American Secretary of State. In 2005, he was succeeded as Secretary of State by Condoleezza Rice, the first black woman to hold the post. Barack Obama. African Americans reached the pinnacle of U.S. politics when Barack Obama was elected president in 2008. The son of a black father from Kenya and a white mother from Kansas, Obama was a first-term U.S. senator from Illinois when the Democrats selected him as their presidential candidate.